Thank you, Tanya. Yeah, so like Tanya said, I'll be talking about the results from this recent paper that came out back in April on my birthday. So it's quite exciting, about the impact of climate change on cacti. Let's see. So the reality that we're faced with nowadays is that we have an extinction rate that's 1,000 times higher than the background rate. So before human beings had an influence on the extinction rate. And there's been estimates that 1 in 6 species are committed to extinction due to climate change itself. And with everything going on in the future, the way we're going, the extinction rate may end up being 10,000 times higher than the background rate. And so that means that there's a lot of species out there that need conservation intervention and not enough money to go around. So you all know about cactus, of course. Just a quick recap here. It's a plant family of over 1,500 species, ranging all across the New World, except for one pesky ripsalis that does make it to Africa. And to show you the data that we worked with for this project, this is from a big biodiversity database, so I'll go into a little bit more detail later. When you plot out all those data that we work with, it really captures the diversity in terms of where cacti live. This is a Whittaker plot with temperature on the horizontal axis and precipitation on the vertical axis. And all the black dots are cactus observations. And so there's clearly a center in regions with high temperatures and low precipitation, what people typically think of when they think of cactus, so arid regions. But there's plenty of observations in rainforests and in colder regions. Really, the only biome that we don't have any cactus observations in is a tundra, all the way at the bottom left of the plot. So there's a wide variety of growth forms, columnar species, globose cacti, prickly pears, epiphytes, and so on. People tend to forget a lot about the epiphytes, although it does look like there's some folks on the call that specialize in epiphytes. Some random pictures: Mammillaria herrerae from Mexico, Strophytum asterios from United States and Mexico, Cactaceae reichenbachii, Arizona, Puntia echios from the Galapagos, Warzicactus semipotonus, South America, Micrantoceras flaviflorus alvinii, one of my favorites, from Brazil, Ceres childsii, and we don't know where that one came from. It might be a horticultural relic. Zeabentia verticulata doesn't really look much like a cactus to a lot of people. And then when it comes to cactus conservation, cacti are one of those really highly threatened groups, more so, I believe, than reptiles and birds. I have to double check that number. And so when the IUCN did their first round of cactus assessments, they found that 31% of species at the time were considered threatened. And a large fraction of those species are actually located outside of protected areas. So a big problem for conservation in situ. So in the paper that was published through that IUCN assessment, we can see some of the factors affecting cacti in the wild. And the top stressors are definitely agriculture, even aquaculture. There's a species threatened by shrimp farming in Baja, biological resource use, development, and so on. But the impact of climate change was previously pretty much unknown. If you look at this plot again, climate change ranked near the bottom as one of the threats affecting cacti. And that wasn't really because folks thought that cacti weren't affected by climate change, but simply because it's really hard to assess whether climate change is affecting a species or not. So what I wanted to answer is how cacti will be affected by climate change. And so if you go out and ask any random person on the street that might not be very familiar with cacti, their hypothesis would likely be that they like the heat, they like dry conditions. So if climate change proceeds, cacti probably will be happy. But if you ask a biologist, then they will probably answer, well, any species, including cacti, are adapted to the historical climate that they're used to. So they'll be negatively impacted. So how do we see how cacti will actually be affected by climate change? One option is just wait and see. That's obviously not something we want to do. We could look at individual species for which we have long-term demographic data, and then use techniques such as integral projection modeling. That's something you could do for very few species for which there's a lot of data. It's possible, for example, for swallow. You can do experimental studies where you artificially heat or make conditions drier for individual plants. That's been done before, and it's been found that for many species, even a very low degree of experimental warming decreases photosynthesis pretty strongly. I believe there's a study out there for a kind of cactus, or Krumlinia grosonii. And then lastly, since we are dealing with that reality of many species being affected in the wild, being threatened in the wild, we need to look at many species simultaneously. And one of the techniques that makes doing that possible is species distribution modeling, which is also known as range modeling, envelope modeling, or niche modeling. And so that's the technique that I use. That's what the talk about today will cover. So a lot of people might not be familiar with species distribution modeling, but it's really quite simple. So we're going to start with an example here. So this is a map of all the occurrences of swallow on the landscape that we have. So there's clearly a bias towards occurrences in the United States. There's a lot of data missing from Mexico. So that's all the dots on the map. And then there's an expert map in the black outline on top of that. Now, these colors over here represent annual temperature. So the more red, the more orange means higher temperatures. And so just eyeballing this map, you can see that swallow tend to prefer higher temperatures. Then zooming out further, you could ask yourself, well, why are there no swallow in Canada? Well, probably because it's too cold over there. You could do the same thing with precipitation. And you could ask yourself, why are there no swallow in the Amazon? Well, one of the reasons would probably be because it's too wet over there. And so instead of doing this manually, instead of doing this by just asking yourself those questions, what I do is really build statistical models that relate those occurrences to the environment. So I have a computer do all of this. And so doing that, we can create these models for many species simultaneously. And then you can also use those models to predict the distribution of species across space or time. And that helps with assessing how species might perform under climate change. So this is one forecast for swallow. It looks like there's some movement towards the north, trying to keep up with suitable temperatures. So green suitable values outside of the current range. But once again, there's quite a bit of bias because of a lack of data from Mexico, at least available to us for this study. So we might be wrong in some regions. So these range models that we built are valuable to protect endangered species. We could look at parts of its distribution where it will be affected by climate change, or we could focus on areas where we know that it will do fine in the future. We can also design reserves this way. So when you're doing reserve design nowadays, you don't only have to think about where species are now, but where they want to be in the future as well. And this technique can also be used to find new populations. If you build a model for a species that is fairly rare, locally very uncommon. You could build one of these models and predict where new populations may be found, and then you could validate those results in the field and see if there's a population there. And this has been used successfully in quite a few species. So species distribution modeling is a technique that now has been used for a good 40 years or so. We've come a long way, but fortunately in publications, in scientific publications, what happens is that only a single result is shown. So there's only a single forecast, a single prediction of where a species is going to be, dependent on the data that you put into the model, the specific ways that you build it, and so on. But we know that there's a lot of uncertainty associated with these forecasts from many different sources. The occurrence data, there could be misidentified plants, there could be a bias in terms of where you get the data from. That uncertainty could be from statistical processes, which I'll get into a little bit more later. It could come from climate itself. We're uncertain about the extent of climate change in the future. And so when this uncertainty is not communicated, that really limits the stock we can put into our predictions. And so a secondary question is not only how cacti will be affected by climate change, but how certain are we of those projections? So a little bit about the methods now. I started with 1,000 records or so from the N database, covering 1,257 species of cacti. Then after cleaning up those records, we were down to 408 species of cacti that had 10 or more occurrences per species. And then for each of those 408 species, we came up with 6,480 predictions, modeled with a specific algorithm called maxent. And why so many different predictions? Well, to capture the uncertainty that I was just talking about, we use different climate projections. So for 2050 versus 2070, different climate models, different climate scenarios, depending on human emissions. We use different statistical decisions, the complexity of the model, the specific bioclimatic variables that were chosen. So in other words, what variables we think species will respond to, whether they be temperature or precipitation. And then we also use different migration capacities. So when species try to keep up with their suitable climate in the future, they'll have to move. And we don't know very much about how fast species can move, especially when it comes to plants. So with plants, we often have what's called a fat-tailed dispersal kernel, which means that sometimes seeds can move a very long distance, very rarely, but it does happen. So we use different scenarios for migration as well. And all in all, this brings us to over 2.5 million predictions for these 408 species altogether. In terms of the statistical quality of the models, if you are familiar with species distribution modeling, all of our models tended towards a AUC score of almost 1, which is almost perfect. So the model quality was pretty good. I'm not going to linger on this. For the results, 60% of species were projected to lose part of their range under climate change. And so that number comes from, for every species, averaging or taking the median for all of the predictions for that species. And so since we have all these predictions for each species, we can also say something about the certainty. So we're very confident about this for 14% of species. Which means that the mean prediction plus or minus a standard deviation does not overlap 0, which is no change. And almost a quarter of species lose over 25% of their range. So the decreases are pretty significant for a lot of species. So you might think that's great. 60% of cacti do poorly under climate change. That means 40% of cacti are winners. Unfortunately, when we look at the certainty for those species, we're only confident for 1% of them. So almost no species we're pretty confident saying that they'll do great under climate change. Now, given that we all have these different predictions and these different sources of uncertainty, we can also rank the sources in terms of how much uncertainty they explain. So on this plot, there's two types of sources of uncertainty. One is statistical or a modeling decision, and the other one is a climatic source of uncertainty. And so the ones in red are the climatic sources, and as it turns out, they play very little, they play a very small role in determining the certainty of our predictions. So regardless of how much climate change we're seeing, it doesn't really impact our predictions that cacti will do poorly under climate change. The biggest sources of uncertainty are the complexity of the model, and then also the projection distance. And the projection distance is just a fancy way of saying the migration capacity of the species. So that's definitely something that's really, those two factors are really important for further research in trying to constrain our uncertainty in how cacti will respond to climate change. And again, I'm not going to linger too long on this, but we can look at the impact of some of these sources. So at the bottom of this table, we see the projection distance. So varying the projection distance, I don't know if you can see my cursor all the way at the bottom of the table, increasing the projection distance from no migration at all to species being able to migrate 100 kilometers over the next 50 years, well, that improves our forecast by 5%. Going up to 500 kilometers, which is pretty unrealistic, we go up to an improvement over by 13%. Another thing that all these models allowed us to do was look at correlations between our predictions and various ecological metrics or conservation metrics. So we saw no relationship between how restricted a species is in its distribution and how well it will do under climate change. So it doesn't seem like there's a relationship between rare species doing worse or common species doing better. There's no pattern there at all. And that's in direct contradiction to what's been previously found for some species from Baja. So that indicates that these patterns may be regionally specific. Also, expert map richness is something we looked at. And the coefficient here is really small. It has a very, very small effect, but it's a negative one. And so that means that areas where there's a lot of cacti tend to do worse. So the species in areas with high richness tend to decline more under climate change. We also looked at the growth form, and the only significant pattern that we found here was that epiphytes do worse. And there's a lot of epiphytes out there. So that's also problematic. Why this is, well, we don't really know from these models, but one potential hypothesis could be that epiphytes have a more restricted climatic range because of their specialized habitat. There was also no link between conservation status as determined by the red list and how well species did. So it doesn't look like critically endangered species or endangered species did worse than species that are not threatened at all. So that's a good thing. So we could look at individual species like we just did, but we could also look at the aggregate results. So we take all the maps for all these species and stack them on top of each other. So for each combination of all these statistical decisions and climate decisions, we then also end up with a richness map. And so this allows us to, one, validate our models by looking at whether or not our predictions for richness look similar to expert maps, which have been created by the IUCN. And it also allows us to forecast richness and focus on areas that are predicted to decline in richness under climate change. And so here on the left is our predicted average richness across all the maps we produced, with a more blue or purple color, meaning more species occur there. And on the right-hand side is the expert map expert richness map based on IFCM results. So from a qualitative perspective, they compare pretty well, which means that our models do a fairly good job at predicting where cacti are. So this is for the present time. So now let's look at the future. So we have two versions here, once again, average across all these different richness maps. On the left is an absolute change in species richness. So how many more or fewer species we're going to end up with as predicted by our models. And on the right, we have a relative change. So a fractional change in species richness. So in terms of the colors here, blue, the more blue you get, the better. That means an increase in species richness. The more yellow or red you get, the worse. So there's a decrease in species richness. And you can see here that some of the hotspots of cactus diversity, like central Mexico, where there's a lot of microendemics, do pretty poorly. Parts of Brazil also are going to be badly affected. Looks like the Sonoran Desert, where I am, seems to be doing fairly well under climate change. That's great. But again, there's a lot of areas where we see large decreases in species richness. The pattern that you can definitely see here is that species want to move towards the north in the northern hemisphere and towards the south in the southern hemisphere, as well as up in elevation along Western South America. So that's what you would expect as a signature from species responding to climate change. If temperatures go up where you're at, then you want to move to cooler temperatures that you're used to. So that means moving north or south, depending on where you're at, or up in elevation. Once again, we can look at the sources of uncertainty for our predictions here. And so we see the same important drivers of uncertainty. The dark brown being model complexity. So that plays a role in big chunks of South America. But the majority of the map is really covered by projection distance. So that's that yellow, that pale yellow color. And so both for individual species as well as predictions for richness, it's our lack of knowledge about how fast cacti can move across the landscape over time that limits our certainty about our predictions. Climate, the extent of climate change didn't play a role as the major source of uncertainty anywhere on that. So with these maps, we can also more visually assess the roles of some of these sources of uncertainty. So let's look at dispersal here as an example. So these are predictions for future cactus richness for the year 2070 and 3 different dispersal scenarios. The first one that I'm showing here is cacti being able to move about 500 kilometers or about 300 miles. And so you see some purple on the map, which means high species richness, especially in Mexico. So looks great. And now try to pay attention to the way the colors are changing as I scroll through these. Next up is 100 kilometers or about 60 miles, no more purple. And everything is looking a lot more light blue, so fewer species. And then lastly, probably the most realistic scenario is no dispersal at all. I don't think we're going to be seeing any appreciable dispersal or migration of cacti over the next 50 years. So there's no migration in this scenario. So very pessimistic scenario, but unfortunately also a fairly realistic one. Another thing we looked at was the human footprint and the impact on richness, or the correlation with richness rather. So we took a map of the human footprint, which means the impact, a quantitative estimate of human impact in a specific area on the map. And we found that that footprint is positively correlated with predicted current cactus richness. So that means areas where there's a lot of cacti, we also have a lot of human impacts. And then specifically for climate change, we found a negative correlation between a predicted change in richness and human footprint. So that means that areas where we're expecting to see a large decline in cactus richness due to climate change, those are also the areas where there's large human impacts. And this is assuming that human impacts will stay static, so will not change for the future, which we also know is not true. So there's a lot of areas where we're going to be getting a double whammy, where species are doing poorly due to climate change, and also where there's a lot of threats due to human impacts. So back in 2016, when the IUCN paper was published, climate change ranked near the bottom of the list of threats. Now, based on these results, with 60% at least of species doing poorly under climate change should be near the top of the list of threats to cacti. And unfortunately, these results are conservative. So these models are based on the impacts of climate only. So species are not just restricted in where they occur by climate. A lot of them have specific habitats they occur in, like the epiphytes that rely on host species. There's habitat specialization in terms of the soils that species occur in. There's also a lot of rare species that we don't model. And even though it doesn't look like rare species will do worse, these results may be biased by the fact that we can't model some of these rare species because they only occur in a single spot. Then migration. So the 60%, the average number I threw out there at the beginning of the presentation, really averages across all these scenarios for migration. And if we're looking at a migration scenario of almost zero dispersal over the next 50 years, then those results get quite a bit worse. So we need to know more about the ability of species to migrate. Extreme events aren't modeled. It is incredibly difficult to forecast extreme events, and that includes things like changes in fire regime, changes in dry conditions, so heat waves, especially dry heat waves. So these things are not modeled, and they're more than likely to have a negative impact on species in general. Then also invasive species are not modeled. For the case of saguaro here in the Sonoran Desert, even though our distribution models, so our estimates say that saguaro will do just fine under climate change, that does not take into account some of the changes in extreme events, so that are facilitated by invasive species. For example, we have buffalo grass here that's getting out of hand, and buffalo grass is really changing the fire regime, as well as choking out saguaro seedlings. So fire is becoming more frequent, and saguaro is not a fire-adapted species. A lot of the saguaros die, so there's no reproduction there. And even when seedlings come in, they get choked out by the buffalo grass, which can regenerate fine after fires. So what now? And so from this point on, this is not really based on the paper. These are my personal opinions. So in situ conservation managers they need to protect where species are, but they also need to protect where species will be. And so this needs a paradigm shift. So a change in the way that conservation managers think about conservation in the field. And so right now, there's this workshop going on the genus Copiapoa, involving a lot of stakeholders from across the world, all levels of society. And this is one of the first times that climate change is really being strongly taken into account for designing conservation plans. Researchers should really contribute to biodiversity databases. A lot of people do. But there's so much data out there that people like myself don't have access to because they're not in a centralized database. And so I strongly recommend that if you do field research, that you contribute to these biodiversity databases. For example, the one I used, which is the BN database, the Botanical Information and Ecology Network. And also, there's still a lot of cacti that are being discovered every year. And a lot of these descriptions still don't have a assessment of conservation status in the descriptions. It's starting to change, but when you're describing a new species, you should not just base your description on morphological differences. Try to get the ecological differences in there between the focal species and sister species, but also look at conservation status. And then this is a big problem, unfortunately. Don't endanger species by hiding them. And an example of this here is the species on the right, Pierbrownia browniorum. And this is a quote, and I'm choosing to have these people remain anonymous. But this person said, and he's found Pierbrownia browniorum in the wild now, is that the issue of hiding location is something that needs to be evaluated again. I understand that hiding helps prevent theft of plants by some unscrupulous collectors, but there's another side. Without knowing where the plants are, the government and scientists cannot make protection plans. I found the site of Pierbrownia browniorum, and it is ultra threatened by mining and wind farms. It can destroy everything, as it was not known where the rare plant was in the region of the enterprise. So if even conservation biologists and researchers do not have access to information on where a species occurs, then we can't protect that species. It'll be protected from collectors, but it will not be protected from developers and just land use change in general. So for people who do ex situ conservation, and I think this is an incredibly important aspect now that we're dealing with climate change, in situ conservation is simply insufficient. There's not enough money out there to protect every species in situ. And even if there were, it doesn't matter how much money we throw at climate change because we are going to have to learn how to let go. Some species will simply not make it in the wild. And that's not just due to climate change. Here's another example from Aruba. Even though climate change might affect these species, this person just pointed out to me that this is a center of diversity for Pilosoceras and mellowcactus in Aruba, and people put a water park in. This used to look like this. Researchers and managers, so including the people that describe species, should really facilitate ex situ efforts. And often that doesn't happen. So new species are described, even if we know that it's endangered in the wild already, as soon as it's described, nothing with it happens. And so that was the case with Monvolea estevesii, or Ceres estevesii, Mirabella estevesii, whatever you want to call it. It was described, it was known that it was very endangered in the wild, and its habitat's been, at the type locality, has been completely destroyed. And only one time were these plants actually brought out of habitat. So one fruit made it out of habitat before the type locality was destroyed. But due to the difficulty of facilitating proper conservation programs within Brazil, where the species is from, that fruit was smuggled out and was given to someone in Europe, and all the plants died due to a hailstorm. So the plant may also be extinct in cultivation. So we need proper ex situ conservation programs. It's important to keep in mind that ex situ conservation is not just stuffing plants into a botanical garden. That's just silly. And sometimes that does happen. In the case of Ripsalis triangularis, which has been rediscovered now, thankfully, the original collection, which was deposited in Germany, well, it wasn't a live collection, it was in the herbarium, and it was never really cultivated for a long time. So now it is making its way out into the wider world, and the future is safe, but that's not always the case. Controlled propagation is key. And so this comes back to, it's not enough to stuffing plants into a botanical garden. You got to propagate them. You got to make sure that species stays pure. And when that doesn't happen, we can still lose a species. This is the case for Discocactus subterranea proliferans. It's often lumped into another species of Discocactus, but it was discovered and the type locality was destroyed. And plants did make it, or at least seed did make their way into cultivation. Unfortunately, not into a botanical garden, as far as I know. But the plants in cultivation are not being propagated in a controlled manner. So these are some quotes. I am quite sure that this disco is extinct in the wild and probably soon also in cultivation worldwide. Then regarding the cultivated plants, I know the nursery and would not suggest a trust in these plants. Having seen the procedure of pollination with one brush, they produce only hybrids. So a lot of the mother plants are of good origin. And then lastly, someone who's tried to rediscover it in the wild over the past few years. They traveled with a friend of someone else. He received general directions. However, the person with whom we had contacts already searched its region for several days without finding anything. So we cut away this one on our trip as we'd already lost time early on the trip. So no success for disco cactus subterranean proliferans. Propagation can also be collaborative. And that means involving stakeholders across society. Not just botanical gardens in the native country, botanical gardens abroad as well as people that cultivate cacti for a living. So all sources of potentially ensuring the prolonged existence of these species need to be explored. They need to be taken into account. Distribution to stakeholders in a controlled, ethical, legal way can reduce poaching because plants are more readily available. It can avoid extinction simply because there's more people with these plants out there. It can fund conservation, and it can educate the public. Too often, what we're seeing nowadays is a disconnect between researchers, managers, and amateur botanists and horticulturalists. They're too often alienated. And we are dealing with a big problem with poaching. But we have to keep in mind that most people that love cactus and like growing them are not poachers. A lot of these people go out into habitat and they take pictures and record where species are. And they're often not sharing that data because they're worried about being called poachers simply because they go see plants and habitat. Most of these folks really care about conservation. And those data could really help us with future research and with conserving the species that we care about. So I call this the ivory tower of cactology, and it's something that we need to avoid. We need to involve all stakeholders across society, both in native countries as well as internationally. Here's some more quotes. They're so strict here when you import cacti. They actually seize it if you can't show phyto certificates, all for protecting wild cacti. But that same department allowed continuous destruction of our own local cacti for condominiums we don't need. This was about Aruba. Another one, I ordered Pilosacera seeds from the Netherlands that came with a plant passport, which is now required. Customs seized and destroyed it to fight illegal poaching, even though that was a proper procedure. They don't know what the EU plant passport is, but it's okay to remove 80-plus-year-old columnars to build a boutique hotel on a hill and call it an eco-retreat. So all of us, stakeholders, researchers, managers, growers, we care about cacti. And we're all working towards the same goal, which is conserving. So sometimes conservation efforts actually get in the way of conservation and get in the way of people trying to protect these species, trying to grow these species. So this is the CITES list for cacti, and there's a bunch of species on Appendix 1. The rest of them are automatically in Appendix 2. But footnote 4 over here that you see at the top right, when you look at that, that says that all seeds from Mexico, for example, are excluded from being on Appendix 2. So such a blanket ban on being able to legally export seeds and sharing them with other botanical gardens has really restricted the way that some of these ex situ conservation managers want to protect cacti. And that's not a good thing. If even researchers cannot get export permits, then we're standing in the way of conservation rather than encouraging it. It also has big impacts on cultivators, for example. I have a little shop on Etsy as well, just another source of another way of selling cacti. And one of the cacti I sell on there is propagated Melocactus conoideus, which are CITES 1, I believe. I just ship them within the United States, so completely legal. These came from cultivated specimens, which have been around for a very, very long time in cultivation. And so Etsy just, out of fear of legal repercussions, just simply banned all plant species cited on CITES appendices 1, 2, and 3. And so if you think about cacti, that includes every possible cactus out there, except for some Schlumberger cultivars and so on. So we have to watch out what we're doing with our legislation. It has to protect cacti, but it also has to make common sense. Can't actually, we can actually have some really bad impacts, negative impacts on conservation if we don't think about what we're doing. So I would like to thank my advisor, Brian Enquist, and my lab, as well as my collaborators on the paper, and then my friend Tristan Davis, as well as the National Science Foundation and Conservation International. Thank you very much. Actually, I'll finish with this slide over here. So when this paper was published, climate change is kind of a controversial topic. And so I did an interview with a news station here in the United States. They put it on YouTube, and these were some of the comments. And so it's this way of thinking that we need to try to change to deal with climate change impacts on cacti. So I won't leave this up for too long. Here's some more pretty pictures. And I am available for questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michiel. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. Unfortunately, not very uplifting, but you finally put together all these ideas about cactus conservation that people have been discussing for a while. Please, people, you can either raise your hand with the little button, a little hand at the bottom of your screen, or you can write it down on the chat if you have a question. I have many questions, so why don't we start with my question and we'll let people think about theirs or write them down. Let me choose the one I want to ask. Do you have, Michiel, is there any example of a species where we already can see the effect of climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing, for example, in the Sonoran Desert, reproductive failure for saguaro. We're seeing reduced flowering, which is already pretty episodic. We are not seeing the typical cycles of boom and bust recruitment for saguaro. And also more casual evidence is what we're seeing. A lot of people, for example, working on Copiapoa in Chile are reporting that populations just seem to be dead. And so there's these large mature plants that were not killed by human beings, were not eaten by herbivores or diseases, that are just dead. There's no seedlings. And so the only option really is climate change. So climate change is very, very difficult to invoke as, well, that's what killed this individual. But when you're having these multiple sources of evidence that all point towards climate change being a threat, then that's a valid source of evidence.
Yeah, for example, in agave, we have examples of wildfires where they used to happen, or extended droughts that just kill entire populations, but it's hard to relate to climate change by itself.
Yeah, so, especially for agave, I can imagine for monocarpic species like that, it's not a good thing. That's an entire yeah, that's pretty much forever.
Yeah. So nobody else is raising hand, I think. If not, I would like to ask you, so I work for a botanical garden, and we are mainly, well, ex situ conservation institutions, and we are trying to improve our ex situ efforts and plan ex situ conservation for the future. However, for example, we had a situation where we wanted to propagate a species, that is highly endangered, and it has a very limited range. And we were not allowed because some laws do not allow. This is such a endangered that you are not allowed to propagate. So what do you think about this recalcitrant conservation? Is that only thing that preserving the plants in the wild is the only way? What should we tell them?
Unfortunately, the changes that we need to see from a legal perspective need to come from higher up. We need to put pressure on these organizations, both at a national and an international level, to make it easier for ex situ conservation managers to propagate these species. And I know exactly what you're talking about. Within the United States, if you ship species between states within the country, and one of the species is listed on the endangered species list, the national list, then you cannot ship it without Fish and Wildlife approval, which is almost impossible to get, even as a botanical garden in a lot of cases. So I grow, for example, Consolea coralicola, which is highly threatened, it's critically endangered. And I've had folks in Florida, including botanical gardens, ask me to send them some. And I cannot legally do so. I cannot ship it across state lines. And people who have tried to get these permits have been told that they should not even apply because it will draw attention to them and might get them in trouble, even though that the specimens that they have are legally acquired. So what do? Well, try to change the law. It's not helping conservation. And I think there was someone with a question in chat, but he said he didn't know how to raise his hand.
Oh, let me see. I have a question.
Hi.
Luis. Luis is here. Yes, go ahead, Luis. We can hear you.
Hey, Michelle. That was a very good presentation. I really like it.
Thank you.
And well, I would like to add a comment and also ask you a question. So, well, as you know, and I also have a greenhouse in Mexico, so I legally reproduce cacti. And it's very hard, as you said, because so people, they from other countries, they ask me for sending plants to other countries. I don't do it because I like to do things legally. But when I try to do things legally, it's very hard because a lot of permits are needed. I understand that why they ask them, but at the same time, it's so hard to get them, and it's so expensive that then it's not feasible to send cacti to other countries. And the problem is that in Mexico, we have a lot of species that people want. So what I think what they do maybe is that because we cannot send them to other countries, maybe they come here to Mexico and then they take the plants from the habitat. So I think that's also a very big problem, as you said.
Yeah, I think from an economic perspective, if you make it harder to acquire these plants in a legal way that doesn't affect how well the plants do in the wild, then what you're inadvertently doing is you're driving up the demand for those plants. Everyone wants something that's rare, and thereby like they become more expensive. It's not decreasing, it's not reducing people going out into the wild and poaching them that way. It just increases demand, because if people see an opportunity to make more money because it's difficult to do this legally, then they're just going to do it illegally. So it turns into a cycle where there's increased demand and just increased poaching, even though your goal and the goal of many of us is to reduce poaching.
That's true. Yes. And I also had a quick question. So I found very interesting that you said that when you included the dispersal ability of the cacti in the model, then it was more optimistic. But do you know about any studies that in which they have estimated like the dispersal distance of cacti? I don't have one in mind, but I don't know if there are like.
No, not really. I've tried to look, not for a prolonged period of time, but the only species for which I think this data could potentially exist is for swallow, where you have historical data on pack rat middens, and so the rate at which saguaro moved during past climate change, for example, during the ice ages. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to generalize that to different species because there's such differences in dispersal modes. So the short answer is no. And unfortunately, this problem is not limited to cacti. It's pretty much the case for all plants. It's very difficult to look at, and it's also something that should be a primary focus if we want to increase the validity, if we want to increase the confidence that people have in these distribution models under climate change.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that was a very interesting observation, and maybe there should be more studies about dispersal abilities of cacti, because I would think they don't disperse like very long distances, as you said. I know they also have a very high habitat specificity. So
yeah,
that was very interesting. So thank you. It was a very interesting talk.
Luis and Michelle, I was thinking also about a question about dispersal, because Michelle, you mentioned that the more realistic scenario is zero dispersal over the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Well, my question, I was wondering how did you get to that, to those data, to that amount of years, and also how could we study dispersal? Do you have, perhaps you or anybody here, because we have here many experts in this audience, so how would you study this? How do you address this issue? How do you study dispersal? It's really hard.
So my estimate, which is it's not very well founded in evidence, but when you look at a lot of the columnar species, when you want a new cohort, a new reproducing cohort, then simply a lot of these species don't reach sexual maturity until decades into their life. So even if you have dispersal now, then 50 years from now, you're probably still not going to have a viable population wherever it dispersed to. So that's not necessarily the case for smaller species, but for a lot of the smaller species that do start reproducing quite quickly after germination, for a lot of them, dispersal is more local. So that's one reason. And then secondly, when we're thinking about the upper estimate here of 300 or 300 miles, that's very, very unlikely. So a species moving across the landscape and keeping up with suitable climate doesn't just mean that there's a single individual keeping up with that suitable climate. It has to be a viable population in order for that species to continue into the long-term future. So it's not enough for just a few individuals. So to study this, what a lot of people do is seed trapping. So they simply see what seeds end up in a specific spot. So that's often that's often done with pollen even. And so what that typically results in is a fat-tailed dispersal kernel where you have most seeds landing near the parent plant, but then in a few very rare cases that are very difficult to observe, they end up far away. And so that might still lead to a viable population, because that's often how invasive species start to get established. So just a couple individuals end up a long distance away and they can reproduce and they get established. But it's incredibly hard to estimate these very rare, very stochastic events. So I don't really see a good solution to the problem. Something that has been a big question in ecology since its inception. Something that people do ask about sometimes is the potential of assisted migration, where we move some individuals across the landscape to a more suitable climate. Unfortunately, it does not seem that most cacti transplant very well. So I heard I've seen one successful example of Coleocephaloceras in Brazil that Marlon Machado showed in a lecture a few years ago. There are some successful transplants in Arizona as well, but especially for large columnar species, it's not really an option. And for some genera, I believe for Copiapoa, it's pretty much always unsuccessful to transplant individuals. So.
Yeah, that's usually the case. Is there any other question? Luis, you still have your hand raised. Do you want?
Yes, I just wanted to add about the dispersal thing. So one way to model it is, so I did like a dispersal model for, well, another species in Costa Rica. So we knew the seed disperser, and then we modeled the movement behavior in the landscape. I don't know how difficult would that be for cacti, because some of them, I would think they're like ant dispersed maybe, and some lizards, they disperse the seeds, I think, but maybe that's a way. And another way, I think, a lab member, he was using genetics to see the dispersibility of the same species I studied. So that, I think those are the ideas I have right now in my mind.
Yeah, that's absolutely a good way of going about it. I think the issue with a lot of cacti is that there's dispersal by multiple organisms. So you'd have to do this for every disperser. And then you want to do it.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Also perhaps dispersed by water. So for some small cacti mammillaria, we think that it might be just the seeds falling to the ground, and when the rain comes, it washes them, and that might be perhaps a relatively longer dispersal. We don't know.
Yeah. There's some fun dispersal mechanisms out there. I know that's also the case for Strophocactus wittii.
But this is an area we know very little about in general in the family. Any other question, people in the chat? I'd like to hear Michel's opinion on the importance of germination experiments, to provide information to databases such as the one he's been using. Yeah, wonderful question.
Yeah, so there's an amazing amount of literature out there on germination experiments in cacti, and a lot of it is focused on prickly pears and choyas and relatives and so on. Unfortunately, it seems that the results tend to be very idiosyncratic. So optimal germination conditions tend to be very species dependent, even when it comes to simple measures of temperature. So maybe there are some generalizations to be made, but nobody's really gone out. What I think needs to happen is a meta-analysis of all these experiments, where we look to see if optimal germination conditions are the same for closely related species. So we're looking for what's called a phylogenetic signature of these optimum conditions. Are these conditions conserved? So unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, and the germination niche, the recruitment niche, is often very, very narrow compared to the climatic niche of the adult plants. So in other words, seedlings simply do not tolerate the conditions or the wide variety of conditions that adults do. So that's another source of, unfortunately, that's another source of that section I had about warnings in my talk. So it doesn't matter if your adults survive. If your seedlings don't survive, then you're eventually going to end up with nothing, like once your adults die. Germination experiments are incredibly important. They're very difficult to integrate into these models, but it is an incredibly important avenue. And I would say probably alongside the impact of extreme events and dispersal, one of the three main goals of any future research should be on the seedling niche. And so there's been work when it comes to the databases. There's been work to not only have occurrence data in these databases, but also to have other associated data like range maps that are produced, or trait data like flower color or size. And germination data is also important to include. Where could these experiments be done? I think a promising source for these types of experiments is the cryobanks that people are working on. So there's botanical gardens out there that have a cryobank for seeds. And so if they keep adding seeds to those banks, then they can also take some of those seeds for germination experiments. So that's definitely a possible avenue. So in some cases, there's more seeds conserved of species than adult plants. But that's a great question.
Michelle, and besides all the traits, also genetics will be important to account.
Absolutely. A linkage between databases on ecological data and then genetic data. I don't know to what extent that's become a reality yet, but it definitely needs to happen. Definitely needs to happen. Unfortunately, it seems that every person, every research group out there has their own idea of what the ideal database should look like. So what we're seeing now is the proliferation of these databases. And so everyone's doing their own thing, and there's barely any communication between these different groups. And so that's standing in the way of research efforts rather than encouraging them. So I think that's the point we're kind of reaching right now, where we really need standardization and people to talk to each other and share those data.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question? I don't see anyone raising their hand or writing in the chat. I would like to end with the last question.
Okay.
If somebody comes and give you enough resources to study and protect and preserve one species, well, these two questions, one species or one group, could be genera or some, which one would you choose?
So my favorites, I'm very partial to Brazilian cacti. And I think that's where a lot of the big conservation problems lie right now. Like in one case, a species simply not being recognized as a separate species to avoid having to deal with protecting it. That was the case, I believe, with Arahadoa marilene, where the simple way of avoiding having to conserve something is simply saying it's not a separate species, when it clearly is one. I think from a scientific perspective, there's some very endangered mammillaria out there that people have considered extinct in the past before that are still around. People that are mostly horticulturalists know it's still out there, know where they're at, and are propagating it, but they're not receiving any attention. For example, that's the case for Mammillaria chamvariana. And then I'm forgetting another species where people know it's still around in the wild, but it seems that these species have a very natural episodic type of recruitment. So it seems that, recruitment is very irregular. So at some times of the year, it looks like the species, or like some years, it looks like the species doesn't exist at all. So we definitely need to know more about seed banking in cacti and the effect on population dynamics. Right now, I'm kind of obsessed with Opuntia sheffii, because there was a recent paper that said, well, we didn't find it in a survey, so it might be extinct at this point. However, I was talking to someone just a week ago, and he told me he saw the plant in habitat near the type locality as recently as 4 years ago. And since this is a fairly deciduous plant, where the above ground growth just dies off when it's dry, it probably is still around. And we need to know if it is still around in the wild. We need to get it into a conservation program, because it looks like every single individual of this species that's being cultivated is all the same clone. And so that's once again where we run into an issue with administrative and legislative bloat. So you can't export this species, and so it's going to be doomed. The original collection, Opuntia sheffii, is the original Glass and Foster collection from back in the day, and that looks to be the only clone around, unfortunately. So in this case, if someone does grow it natively in Mexico, and it is not that clone, I would be very interested to hear about this. So we need to make sure that there's more than one clone of this species around, so that we can have a population that is still manages to reproduce. And yes, I agree in the chat that we do need a new version of CITES that's focused on plants. The same regulations that we use for animals do not work for plants. And the list of Appendix 1 species for cacti simply does not match the conservation reality. For example, we have the genus Disco Cactus on there. People do love Disco Cactus. This is absolutely true, but there's other Disco Cactus out there that are not endangered at all. You ask yourself, why is this entire genus on there when it's only a couple species that are doing poorly in the wild? So yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this talk. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Today we had, when our highest, we had 43 participants from 10 countries, if I didn't miss one. So keep tuned for our next ICANN seminar. This one was wonderful. Thank you, Michelle, and see you everybody soon.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to the talk.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to contact me if anyone has any questions or wants to explore any sort of collaboration. I'm always interested. I'll put my email address in the chat one more time.